Welcome to the Unfolding Thought Podcast. This is Eric Pradum. I'm joined today by Jeremy Nulik. Jeremy is a futurist, theoretician, and practitioner in strategic foresight and storytelling. Today, we touch on Jeremy's unique journey, his focus on helping organizations visualize and prepare for the future, the practice of strategic foresight, how leaders can better navigate uncertainty, and a project Jeremy worked on all around the future of the city of Houston. And now, a conversation with Jeremy Nulik. Well, Jeremy, thank you for joining me. I will have recorded and given a bit of introduction before this, but because I'm sure you will do it much better, can you please give everyone a little bit of your background?
Well, I mean, that's pandering. That is just pandering. I think your introduction will be likely really wonderful. But I'm very, very willing to give the background and very appreciative, grateful that you would to have me in this conversation, wherever it may lead. So I'm always appreciative of conversations with you. I think my background, I'm 46. So when people are asked to give their background, sometimes it's like, well, in the beginning, if you've been in a careers long enough, it's like, where do you want to put the start dot? And so I think that probably some of the more important inflections to talk about is that I'm someone who grew up with a very encouraging background. I had a very privileged background of two people who cared very deeply about me, who, instilled in me a sense that there was something that you could achieve. They were a very thoughtful people and likely probably over-encouraged me in a lot of ways, which is probably how I've ended up here to at least some degree. There's both the nature and nurture argument there. But they, in particular, my father worked first as a high school teacher, and then he was a salesperson for Purina Mills, and that was, he was selling nutrition for cattle, and so it was both sort of this like, here's the science of the nutrition, and here's how the product works. But I also watched him have serialized conversations with people that had nothing at all to do with cattle or nutrition. It had to do with just making a meaningful connection with another human being. And his ability to do that, sort of over and over again, and then shift the conversation to something that had to do with outcomes and science and, how are they going to be more profitable as cattle ranchers and things like this. And so I think that I just osmotically, and because I'm just, like I say, I think I'm attenuated toward a curiosity about the world. I became deeply curious. There's hidden motives. There's things that lie beneath, even with something that is as seemingly boring as cattle nutrition. It had to do with all these like microbiomes and, stomachs. And, like there was all of this stuff that was happening with an animal that you didn't see, and I remember feeling as a child really fascinated that there were things that happened that I couldn't see. They were invisible. And yet there was this scientific explanation of the invisible. And so I was deeply passionate about science, and I wanted to pursue science. I wanted to understand what lies beneath and what went on beyond our understanding. So that's kind of what fueled me a lot into college, where I had the unfortunate or fortunate opportunity to get some work at a writing center. And where I also started to do some work to tell stories with journalism, and just on the lark anyway. And because I needed a job on campus to satisfy a requirement, that was the job I got. And like I say, fortunately, unfortunately, that led me to thinking about these experiences I had with people when they would tell their stories, so people would, and again, I'm pursuing science. I think of myself as a science-minded person, and yet I'm reading stories from these old women about their lives, what they drew meaning from. It was a community writing center, so you had all kinds of people coming in there. You had people bringing in poetry. You had people trying to write one-act plays. You had people, of course, serialized essays and research papers and things like this. And I found that when I was reading people's narratives back to them, and I had this experience with them where it was like, is this really what you wanted to talk about? Is this really the story you wanted to tell? Is this really the meaning you wanted to convey? Um, when I started to have those conversations, they were just deeply meaningful, and they sort of made me take pause on what I thought was, sort of that what seemed like a binary, right? Like when I was coming from science, everything was measurable, and in fact, that's why you did science, was to measure result, to produce something that you can observe, to produce something tangible. And yet, when I was working with people on their stories, it was highly abstract. It was, what meaning does this do? Does this set in your mind? What images are you playing with? And what meaning do they have? And how did that change your decisions? And um, so I would say, what that curiosity I had even as a kid started to shift over into is things like the abstract, So I got a job in journalism, and I'm probably much to the chagrin of the over encouraging parents. Went from something like, "Hey, I could be a doctor," to "I think I'll write stories." And so that's what set me in motion toward wanting to capture and write stories. I met amazing people. I met really people who had deep vision about the world, and those were the people I found most compelling. I did some business journalism for a while, met the founder of Hard Rock Cafe, Tony Hsieh, who founded Zappos, and just got to sit with them for a while and have deeply meaningful conversations about how they saw the world and what kind of worlds they wanted to build. And I noticed that there was this correlation with people who were entrepreneurial and had something that they wanted to do in the world, and their ability to articulate deeply compelling, provocative images of the future. They would talk about a world that didn't yet exist, and they had already built it. It already existed for them, but most of their job, it seemed to me, as an entrepreneurial, visionary sort of person, was in making real, making tangible the evidence or for everyone else that this is a way to see the world. And that to me was just deeply compelling. Then I happened to meet a person named Elliot Frick, who's the founder of Big Wide Sky. And I, through hook and crook, ended up doing a feature on that guy. And shortly thereafter, I had a conversation with him about like what was the basis of some of the ideas that he had, because they were almost heterodox, in their nature. It was they were really compelling ideas. He had ideas about the way that the business world could be looking at itself, and why ROI was essentially a joke, and all of these things that we think are OKRs and KPIs are the end all be all. He sort of had this way to reframe them that gave them a different meaning, and I couldn't really articulate why, but I knew it was different. And he showed me these like stacks of books he had on his desk that were the books for a foresight program out of the University of Hawaii. And he was like, a lot of the ideas that we come up with about like how to create, real alignment in organizations. How is it that we could take something like questions about brand, questions about operations, questions and challenges with culture? How do we reframe them in a way that will reveal what the willingness of the organization is? And he was using strategic foresight or future studies, theory to allow people to have these experiences. And so that to me was really compelling. And I ended up joining in with him, and we ended up, I guess that was like 10 years ago or so. And we've been building experiences for people to contend with images of the future using some immersive technique, like a mixture of those storytelling things that I've talked about, and strategic foresight, because it turns out that those images of the future that we nurture, that we cultivate in ourselves, have an impact on the strategies that we employ. And so our ability to articulate well what those visions are, what those images look like, has a real function, in a very useful function in making meaning out of why strategic decisions exist. And then you can bring to bear all those KPIs and OKRs and all of the scientific thinking to optimize, after you've decided, well, this is really where we want to go, you know? So anyway, that was, I think that's a collapse of 20 years or so. Well, even longer, because I talked about being a little kid. So that was like 40-year history. And an answer to tell me about yourself might be too much.
No, that's great. Thank you. I appreciate it. And I know there is something that we want to get to. So I don't want to get you stuck here. I also don't want to psychoanalyze you, but it seems to me in your story that, there's an important piece of what you described with your experience of your father's work. And I think the way that you put it was helping his clients, his customers, his connections, something like that, be more successful. And you also, I believe, said something about making meaningful connections. And I, as you know, am a fan of jobs to be done theory. I think you are as well, at least to some extent. And that feels complementary or feels in alignment. If you are a cattle rancher, for example, you may need supplements, you may need feed, you may need whatever today. But ultimately, what's the job that you are trying to get done? And if I can continue with that line, it seems to me that came out in your writing center experience, in that whether your father was doing this or not, and I suspect that he was, you were playing the role of sort of like a mirror, or, the role of certain types of therapists or coaches or whatever, in saying, I think you put it as something like, is this really the story you want to tell? And as I've heard you discuss it before, and I think you're alluding to here, your writing center clients, it sounds like they knew things, and I'm putting air quotes around the word "knew." Those things just weren't conscious. And so they had goals, they had desires, they had visions of the future for their project, whatever. And without foresight being a practice that you had learned, a distinct practice or whatever, you were helping make conscious what was already within those people. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that's a brilliant way to put it. And thank you for the psychoanalysis. I mean, I think, yes is my short answer to your question. I think, the conversations that the dad would have, right, with these folks that were trying to put their cattle on a program, there's a lot of science to that. And there's a lot of data to support the decision of how you want to feed your cattle, how you want to nurture that animal such that it performs at its highest when necessary, when it's going to be at market, right? It's not terribly unlike most of the decisions that most business people have to make, right? Like, here is the product we're building. There's a lot of knowns around that, and there's also a lot of methods to achieve that optimal outcome. This is but one of those methods, right? But one of the things that I think that I would witness, and like I say, this wasn't because there was some conscious effort at performing a rigorous analysis of their foresight or doing research or something, but just in conversations, I remember my father would have, these ranchers would talk about how they wanted to figure out how to set up their, their kids, their grandkids, for the best possible success for their chosen way of life in their industry. How is it that we make the best decisions so that it puts their grandchildren in the best possible position to be successful with this way of life, is usually the way they would describe it. Now, cattle were incidental in some ways to that, But what they were really looking for was, some way to sustain the values that they held dear and the way of life that they thought was, the best one for their family. And how do they make sure that how do they ensure, how do they make more resilient that kind of image of the future they have? I mean, those probably weren't the words they'd use, but they want their grandchildren to be successful. That's what success meant, and that's the conversations he would have. And so then decisions about strategy. Well, what ought you feed your cattle this year to get you in alignment with that? The job to be done, to use your frame, was how do I shape and create a legacy that's resilient enough for 50 years in the future. You're talking about grandchildren taking over your operation. That's not just the next generation, that's the one after. That's a very long-term time horizon. But then what it did was it made strategy decisions easier. Then the science made sense. Well, this is the kind of program that I should use to get me closer to that, ultimate outcome that I'm going for. And I suppose you're right. Like, there's this therapy-like conversation that occurs when it comes to how do people construct meaning, like the mirror sort of thing, like I've even seen, and that there's recently advancements with AI that allow people to have conversations with themselves. And so I suppose that, externalizing essentially that conversation is what I was doing in the writing center. I was their voice. If I'm reading back to you something you wrote and I sit with you in that, suddenly things become obvious that you need to change that maybe you just didn't see by yourself because somebody external to you held up a mirror, like you're saying, and said, is this the kind of image you want to make in the future? And I can see now the through line that you were going for, which is to say that if you're doing something like strategic foresight for an organization that's going through a bunch of change and they know they need to make a new strategy, like we need to address our strategy. What used to work ain't working anymore. If I do things like I hold up some images of the future that I assume that your organization is having, it's not terribly unlike what I did in the writing center. And I say, is this really the story you want to tell? Are these the kinds of images that you want to nurture in the organization? Is this the place toward which you want to guide? How might you be able to lead more effectively if this is your vision? And what priorities become suddenly evident to you that you just didn't see before? So I mean, that was the longer answer to your question. My short answer is still yes.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And I'm taking a leap here, I suppose, a logical leap, or, just making some assumptions. But would you say that at least in certain areas, some of the more successful entrepreneurs or subjects of your interviews and your writing later on in your journalistic career, that these people had, in my phrasing, had made conscious some of those unconscious goals, visions, whatever, they had more successfully realized this is what I'm actually trying to do, which then perhaps allowed them to take the steps they needed to take in order to give themselves a better shot at realizing that future, that vision, that goal?
Yeah. I mean, I think that I lack the data and the brain scans to biologically make this argument, but just narratively, or by merit of my experience, it seemed to me that there's a percentage of people who have maybe just a greater talent or a greater sort of ability or intelligence around, almost like who's the Marvel character that sees the multiple Doctor?
Is it Doctor Strange?
Doctor Strange, right?
Okay.
So it's almost like a Doctor Strange like ability, where they what I can see happening when you're talking to them about their future is they're going down multiple sort of branches of possibility, right? They start to play with, well, if this were, and they can hold on to the future lightly, and I think that there are these very useful human emotions of hope and fear, and they're some of our most basic, right? And they're essentially built around evaluating the future. And if you think about our instincts and what allowed us to be a species and live this long, it's because we had some kind of like, well, that would be a bad one. I'm hopeful for that one. Check, right? When it comes to like the next thing we need to do I need to continue running from this predator? Yes, you know, fear-based emotion works. Um, in our current world, the predators are just not as obvious. The challenges are more complex, and so it requires sort of this intelligence around. Well, let's explore what could be for a while, and then kind of sit with it and see which of these kinds of images of the future are the ones I'd like to bring about, and what would be involved in that? Who would I be in that future? And so, um, to more directly answer your question, it seemed that they had a talent, a natural ability, and if anything, the thing that foresight could help with them was, um, how is it that you can embolden and enable people to have an experience that was sort of similar to that, such that they could arrive where you've already been. How do you bring people along with your vision? You may see a world, that has, something like, well, we have actually no more people. There are no more people who have like lack housing, right? Or something like this, some kind of a vision for the world that is grand in nature, or even if it's small in nature, whatever it is, but you have a vision. Now, how good are you at articulating what that really means and what it is and what other people's role might be in it? And that's a component of leadership, right? And so I think that did I witness? I think when I witnessed people who were effective at it, I witnessed those people who could, like Tony Hsieh, right? Is probably a good example. But because he had a very different vision for, let's say, like what customer service means or what it means to provide people an experience, because his whole concept was around delivering happiness. Um, and he wanted to increase the happiness and make moments with people that if they were going to interact with the brand, they were going to be memorable moments that were happy. And it didn't matter if there was a transaction. It didn't matter if they bought something or not, right? Well, then that led to strategies like, we're going to have contests to see how long you can keep people on the phone, which is heterodox. Like, that is the anti-AI chatbot, approach, right? Did it win the day? Well, he was purchased for a really pretty penny, from Amazon, right? So, I mean, he did create some value in the world, and he was able to bring about some aspect of his vision. So I think that, people who are sort of naturally attenuated to vision don't always have the ability to articulate it well and to build sort of a coalition to build better resolution around what that vision is. But I think that there's just a percentage of people who are more attenuated to, well, what's on the fourth horizon, not just what's on that mountain range, but what's beyond the mountain range. And so if anything, I suppose foresight just helps to bring other people along. It raises the floor of people's experience with venturing into that unknown.
If we can draw some lines here, help me understand where maybe the practice of strategic foresight differs from someone having an idea, that generative AI and no coding your apps or whatever. So anybody can start a business now, or there are sort of, as I've heard, there are bets amongst, hedge fund leaders and, our billionaires and all of that around the world are about when will we see the first one person, $1 billion company. And so there are all these opportunities perhaps to just come up with an idea and build that app, build that company, whatever. Can we draw a line between someone having an idea like, oh, I'm going to go and do X, um, and the practice of strategic foresight? Or are we perhaps talking on two different levels in when I am attempting to draw this distinction?
Right. So I think, let's see, I think that having an idea and having an inspired idea about the future is a human experience. Um, some of us have them more often. Some of us have them, and we're leveraged such that we can get VC funding to make that idea happen. Some of us don't. Um, some of us have compelling ideas about the future that are like, I'm going to start a company that does gutters, you know? Um, Having an idea is critical about like it. Um, and making it personal, making it relevant to you, all of that stuff, all of those things occur. I think if there's a Venn diagram overlap between sort of that condition and strategic foresight, I think that there's some overlap. I think it's actually not that great. And the only reason I'd say that is that foresight, as a practice, is more so like its intention is to contextualize and to embolden people to contend with change. So that change could be a change that you want to make. It could be a change that you feel is impressed upon you. It could be a change because you think you want to alter something in your response to the world, your community, the universe, whatever. But foresight as a practice for practitioners is intended to contextualize and to sort of make tangible what are the real components of the change. And one of the things it does in regard to that concept of the idea that I think is useful for this conversation is that I think it helps to sort of how there are a lot of narratives out there. I'm going to start over again. So like there are a lot of narratives about everything's changing and everything's changing so fast, right? And in the face of that, one of the reasons I love foresight so much is it basically says, is it really? You know? Because it says like, well, what things really are changing and what things are actually staying the same and what things are likely things we want to keep and what things do we want to toss over our shoulders. And it's sort of a deliberate nature of making decisions. And having an idea that's inspired is key. Otherwise, you have no reason to venture. Like there's no reason to go into the unknown. But that's only the start, you know. And where foresight picks up is it says, "Great, you have an idea. What evidence is there in the world that there's something that could contextualize that concept or that idea or that vision? Who could be some unexpected partners in your vision that maybe you're not seeing, you know, as a result of looking through a foresight lens at the project or the idea? What might be some of the threats that you're not even seeing? Who are some of the people you're leaving behind in your vision that maybe are important, but you didn't consider it when you just had the spark of your idea? And so what it allows for is I don't know, at the risk of it is both a rigorous because it has a research component to it. And the people I know who are like real foresight practitioners day in, day out are the kinds of people that they remind me of people who like train for Ironman triathlons or something. Cause it's like, I mean, every day they are scanning the world for, quiet, potential signals of disruptions in the future. They're looking for what futurists call Horizon 3, meaning like very long-term impact. And they're contextualizing, they're building essentially databases of here's some insights I have about what the future might be, like what's happening out there. And they're just deeply curious and they're highly disciplined around that. And so that is both a rigor, right? There's some discipline to having that kind of a mindset. It doesn't mean that you have to be a futurist or a foresighter to have that curiosity or to do that. It's just a practice, right? But they're dedicated to it. But then what they also have the ability to do is to take all of that insight and generate some kind of an experience for maybe somebody who has an idea, somebody who says, this is the kind of future I want, and to say, well, here's a mirror of the kind of world you might find yourself in based on the research that we've got. And it's deeply immersive and imaginative and beautiful and interesting. Who might you be in that future? How does your idea hold up now? Like, what kinds of things would you need to change? If this is the kind of future you don't want, what do you need to start doing now to make sure it don't happen? Um, those are that's the nature, I suppose, or the confluence or the meeting point between I have an idea and this is what foresight can do.
For a business leader out there and this is at the risk of restating a bit of what you said earlier, but just to make it clear for me, that an advantage of entertaining this line of thinking or looking far into the future and saying what might be an advantage of practicing strategic foresight at some point may be that while, yes, you are a confident business leader, or yes, you know how to install gutters or lead a gutter company or do accounting or whatever, that if I heard you correctly, essentially change is one part of the nature of life. And if you assume that just because you feel confident about your accounting or how to lead your people or whatever, that does not mean that you will lead your business or your group to the place that you actually desire to go. To go back to those cattle ranchers, for example, just because you feed your cattle today does not mean that you will realize the goals that you have for your grandchildren, for example. Is that an advantage of strategic foresight, or a business leader participating in strategic foresight, is that there is the opportunity to realize what you need to do for the long term and perhaps to gain some humility that you may not have right now?
Yeah, I mean, so I have two different answers to that, of course, but one of them deals with the fact that there's a futurist friend of mine, Jake Dunnigan, who I wish I had said this. I hear it when you read a quote and you're like, man, why didn't I say that? But he said it is better to be surprised by a simulation than to be, sort of shocked by reality. It's better that you simulated something and you're like, oh, Jiminy, rather than being blindsided when suddenly, like you were saying, like change is the nature of our world, and it's always been that way. And while it might seem like change is accelerating, I would just hazard, as someone who takes a look at the horizon of things that change, they're relatively steady clip of change, which means it's just happening all the time. If we were in ancient times or something like this, if we were born a millennia or two ago or something like this, our world would be contending with all kinds of change all the time. We were at the behest of weather. We are at the behest of kingdoms that would come and go. There's all kinds of unknowns, and we would have had to construct for ourselves a way to usefully make decisions and go on and be resilient in the face of change. We are built for this. Human beings biologically are created to deal with change. That's part of our nature, So I think that, it's we've become. If I have an opportunity to have a thesis, I think in the Western world, just sort of, and in the business world in particular, sort of fans of this. If it can't be measured, it doesn't exist. Sort of mechanical understanding of, well, what you need is to just bolt on a better strategy, or you need to bolt on a better whatever. And if you do that, you'll make it super good. You'll Voltron your business until it's completely satisfies any possible whatever. And it's like, well, if we understand that what's animating this is the collective will of a group of people, right? And human beings have everything they need to be resilient and to deal with change. We already have it. It's a matter of sort of revealing, like you were saying, some of those um, what's lies beneath. What is our real motive? What does change really mean? Who might we be in those futures? If you're able to instill that in the business and the organization, particularly during moments of change, is when it's useful. But it's hard. So my second answer to the question is almost like it gets a little more, I don't know, esoteric probably, because the sort of the practice of foresight or curiosity about the future can be understood to be a way of life. Like I am, regardless of my title, or if I'm a CEO, if I'm a executive director of an organization or whatever, there's some change that you want to see come about in the world, or there's something out there, and just remaining deeply curious and looking for signals of change and being open to and willing to to those horizon, sort of challenges in a consistent manner is a way of life. It's not unlike, waking and, looking at your phone and staring at whatever stock reports you do, or what's Bitcoin at today or whatever. If you're going to take the time to do that, then perhaps some spelunking into the what might be on the third horizon, or what curiosities might I be able to run down about the kind of challenges I like to solve, is a way of life. It's a practice. It's a way to be less surprised. It's a way to be less shocked when change occurs. Your organization and really yourself can be better enabled to contend with what might be. So, I mean, that's the utility of it. It's hard for me because I will oversell the hell out of this. Because it's just, it's I mean, yeah, I've seen it just so proven out by the very successful people, like I say, that I've interviewed and that I've come into contact with, that this is just a way of life. This is what I do every day.
I think you've done a really good job of leading up to a thing that I think we both wanted to get to, or, when I asked you to do this, I said, maybe we could talk about this. And that is, you were in Houston not that long ago, and there was a project you were working on. First, I would love if you would describe the project and then tie in a bit of, or make explicit, why is it that it was worth it for the participants in this project?
Sure. Well, I mean, let's see. So recently, there was a conference in Houston around architecture, around the built environment. And one of the things that we already have a natural sort of affinity for Houston. Big White Sky, where we work, has a client there in Kirksey Architecture. And I went to school, at University of Houston for their foresight program. And so Houston's just been a city that's been deeply curious. And for me, in terms of what it is, what is the concept of Houston? What does Houston really mean? Has been an interesting, sort of, it's been a strange attractor for me, I should say. It's one of the fastest growing cities in the United States. It's got an incredibly booming economy. It has this background in petroleum and energy. We've got Houston, we have a problem. So it's got, NASA, and it has an Astrodome. When I was growing up, Houston was sort of a shorthand. It would conjure images of exploration for me. And I didn't even know anything about Houston, So I think that, as a curiosity, Houston just had so much complexity that we were interested in thinking about it. And so it had a natural kind of question around what kinds of futures does Houston have? And so when we came to Kirksey Architecture and we said, hey, there's going to be this conference of architects that's coming up, maybe to kick it off, we do something that would push people into a possible kind of future for Houston in such a way that they're inspired to have more deeply meaningful conversations in particular at a conference, but also hopefully that evening, and so we only had an evening, so this wasn't a sort of like what you might call a formalized foresight exploration or something, but it was intended to be a memorable sort of experience with playing with the future. And when we first went to Kirksey with our concept for the kind of world we could create, when we did our research on Houston, I mean, the thing that comes up over and over as a driving trend about the concern in the built environment is climate change. Year after year now, Houston is experiencing major weather events. They've got hurricanes. They had their first, I think they called it a derecho, but it was essentially a, a tornado. And they hadn't usually had those. They have all these significant weather events. And if you're someone who's concerned with the built environment, things that are supposed to last for 50, 60 years at least, then you're like, well, what do we do now? And so we first went to Kirksey with a climate change themed immersion, and they were like, gosh, this seems, and they're very wise people, our clients are. And so they were like, this seems like the kind of thing that everybody's already talking about. Like, this isn't actually something provocative, because if you look at the narratives for everybody who's gathering around the built environment, they were all about floods or climate change. How are we going to deal with that? And then therefore the rising cost of insurance and all kinds of other, knock-on effects of climate change. So, they're like, that's just, and when we did, granted, then we re-looked at it, and nearly all these narratives were just pessimistic. Like, I guess we'll just move forward and try our best until the wheels fall off. I mean, it was just not it wasn't a very hopeful future. And so what we did instead was we developed an experience around possibility that was so far in time horizon that it allowed for people to cast aside their sort of circumstantial or present day understanding of what major weather events mean, and instead play with a possible kind of future for what Houston could be. And then therefore you bring to bear all of their concerns or their ideas about the present day, but in the context of what Houston might become. And so what people experienced, to about 50 or so people who gathered that evening, they experienced an invitation to Houston's tricentennial celebration in 2136. And that this celebration, the key sort of, the key piece of this invitation was the first manned voyage of the Earth's only space elevator. And I'll admit that when this concept was first thrown out there as the possible kind of immersion, that I was cynical of. I'm like, this is just going to seem like sci-fi. This is part of what, if there is a thing that's tough sometimes when you work in foresight, it's that people think that you're either like woo-woo, like meaning like I'm going to have you hold crystals in your hands, or that you are, sci-fi, like you're just you're only concerned with essentially Star Trek, right?
And when you say this was thrown out, this idea, this is in the planning for this event, how do we get people to think about the future or think more productively about change towards a certain goal? And you were brainstorming, is this the story? Is this the future that we want to present? And is that going to helpfully develop in people's minds realizations or potential plans about what they could do?
Right. Yeah. So I mean, there was a set. We did some signal research, and so there was signal research. We looked at trend data. We looked at populations, and all of it was in the name of, can we create a scenario, a simulated future reality, such that if people were asked to sit with that reality, that new insight about today would come to bear, right? Like if you were put in a situation where this is, we have a voice for you from the future. Here's this invitation. It's an artifact that was created, and it's an invitation to 2136, this tricentennial celebration. And right, like in constructing whatever that was going to be, what we use is our signals, so we look at research. And admittedly, like I said, like you were onto, like this was in the planning phase for this. And when at first I was like, gosh, it just seems like people are going to dismiss it. It's going to feel like it's so not at all plausible that people will feel like, which, it's just not worthwhile to discuss. But
Right. Like you're coming in and you're talking about something that's fanciful
right,
instead of talking about the challenges
the real
I'm
challenge,
facing.
right.
Mhm.
Um, but what we found in our research was that, and even in interviewing some people we knew in Boeing and people who work in space and things like this, they said it was actually less likely that there wouldn't be a space elevator at some point on the Earth's surface because of the mineral deposits that are rich, in space. And so using an elevator to transport those materials makes sense. And I was like, well, okay, so it's plausible then, and we can present it as plausible. But yes, I mean, ideally, what we then did was generate that experience for those 50 people. Um, and, we had them sort of, rather than playing with, do we like this future? Do we think it's unlikely? Do we think it's important? We had them actually just sit with the fact that you put all that aside and you just say, this is the future that occurs. And given different sort of arcs or storytelling devices, talk to us about what happened between now and then that allowed for that to occur, and what kinds of Houston sort of experiences are there. Like what is the nature of Houston given those arcs, right? Those stories. How can you construct those kinds of futures? And so when they did that, they started talking very passionately about the city that they cared about. They started talking. I think I was even telling you about this. I think it's the first time I've seen in an evening session that people were brought to tears when they were talking about what mattered about their city.
Because they were doing things like, if this is where we're going to be in 112 years, here are the things that we have to remember not to lose, for example, or the things that we have to remember to improve upon, regardless of hurricanes or derechos or whatever it is. If we did this, didn't do that, lost that, whatever, that would be a meaningful change for the good or for the bad. Is that what you're saying? Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it was like, and some of it was people, uh, at the risk of making this go on too long, our our present day experience in general is, it isn't. And there is a big sort of like, let's stay in the present. Sort of. There's wisdom in behind some of the traditions that signal that you ought to just remain in the present, and be present for things and be more present and whatever. If you were to look at the quality of what a present day experience really is, it is animated by just countless images from your past and potential images from your future. And those things happen all at the same time. Your present day experience is not actually stuck in time. It's completely liminal. You are harvesting all the time images that you're calling upon. And so then when you give people an image from the future, what happens when the reason they're brought to tears is they start remembering the neighborhoods they grew up in and the people they knew and how they spent their time in this city and what kind of experience they want for their children and their children's children. And all of those things suddenly start coming up that maybe in ways they didn't expect. And part of the responsibility of people who want to do foresight work is to be also empathetic to that condition. Like if we're going to talk about something that is really meaningful to you, we're going to do so in a way that is, sensitive to the fact that you are going to be dealing with that sort of thing. But they did recontextualize then all those big sticky challenges that they had present day. Those came up in these stories. They just came up, to your point, recontextualized. Well, if this is the kind of future we want to build, or if we do end up pursuing, let's say, getting this space elevator constructed in Houston, here's the changes we need to make. And we need to elevate these portions of the city, and that would leave behind these people, though. So what do we do for them? Well, what we could do for them is that we could construct, these mirrors and all this other, apparatus such that, they don't lose light. But we could also have maybe, we could construct realities where people could actually be underwater for a period of time. And maybe we can make portions of the city that are just sort of amphibious from the built environment perspective. Or maybe we abandon the fact that we even need these built environment structures as such, and everything's mobile and it can be, floated up on certain device, like whatever. And so they started talking about what would be necessary to bring about change, and play. And where, again, while it might seem fanciful, what they started talking about was we were to remember that we were resilient as a community, that's what brought us to this place. That came up over and over again. What also came up was maybe there's areas that we need to rethink why they need development, which is a conversation that they've been having over and over again. But that's where rewilding conversations occur, is like, well, if this area floods all the time, what are we doing? How are can we rethink that place? Can we rethink that geography in such a way that it's conducive to the kind of city we want to build without it being a political thing? Does it have to be political? It doesn't have to be. We can talk about the kind of future we want, not in terms of like warring tribe political. It's political in that it deals with people, but it's not, it doesn't have to be capital P political, and the effect it had was that, we've had several conversations up to including, like, even just last night, I was having conversations with people in Houston about that. Really inspired me to rethink our strategy. That really inspired me to think in a new way about what we're trying to do. And that came from the city of Houston, from the Center for Houston's Future, from multiple architecture firms. If you can have experiences where for a moment you can recontextualize, what matters to you, it allows for an inspired way to go about strategy. It's a lot easier to talk about how you want to get somewhere when you know where you want to go. Right. And so I think that's been the overall impact of that work. There was a report that was generated from it where we, and it's this immersive, really fun report that I understand we'll put in some show notes in this future show, so that the either your family or the people that are going through a midlife crisis who want to listen to this can take a look at it.
I realize that a city lives on and evolves in a manner that is in many ways quite different from a business, but at the risk of projecting too much, I think you and I have both seen entrepreneurs who had an idea, and often their idea is something like, you brought up, gutters. I know how to install gutters. I could do that on my own. I could start a business. And rarely, whether it's a software business or a gutter business or whatever, rarely do those entrepreneurs have a vision of just getting rich, of, I'm going to found this business in 2 to 5 to 10 years from now, I'm just going to sell. Often the vision is something about a lifestyle or a quality of life, or just being able to do the work that they want to do. And while many businesses do just close up shop at some point, they collapse due to revenue challenges, or the founders retire and they don't have a buyer, there are some percentage of businesses that sell, whoever they sell to, private equity or an acquiring firm or whatever. And then you and I here, and I'm sure for anyone listening to this, you've encountered this or can imagine it. You hear those founders say something to the effect of, this isn't what I wanted it to be. And again, I'm projecting a bit here, or perhaps overgeneralizing, but might you say that it is worth it to go through this practice of envisioning the future or even reminding yourself about that vision, because there will be times where you will be tempted by current realities or an opportunity, and you will take yourself off course only to realize there's no path back.
That's deep. Yeah. I, I mean, I guess what I would say is, there is a component, I think, in terms of what's useful for business owners in the like present day strategy challenge, that you're right, is the bucket of like, well, let's make sure that this is an inspired strategy. But even longer term, what I hear your question saying is like, it's the legacy component of why you started having a business in the first place, you know? So I think, yeah, part of the utility of something like foresight is that you get to say, like, these are the elements of our business that that can change. These things are just conventions, or they're transcendent, you know. But there are things also that need to remain consistent, and there are some pillars, and we can be deliberate about that in the form of either values or principles or structures or meaning or brand description or whatever it is. But you get to sort of make those decisions more deliberately about what things are not, what things are non-negotiable, what components of my business are the things that should remain, and what things are we like, hey, we're open to change.
And so, do you think that a business owner who might listen to this or find out about the report, that it's worth many at least skimming it? Because as much as it might seem like sci-fi, if you back out a little bit, perhaps you can see that if you were to go through this project, this exercise, maybe you reconnect with, as I put it earlier, some of those things that have remained unconscious or have become unconscious. And by doing so, you may, let's just get very reductionistic. By doing this, you may be able to develop a better strategic plan or make better decisions about what do I do with that choice about software implementation or who I hire, or strategic decisions about what products and services to develop, just by going through this practice, by skimming, or reading in depth. I don't want to assume here. By skimming this report, you might realize that despite the fact that it seems sci-fi or seems a little bit out there from perhaps your very pragmatic, practical day-to-day practices, you could actually make conscious and be committed to the things that make your work both more meaningful and also hopefully more successful.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. You do a good job. You should, yeah, we should switch chairs. Yeah. I mean, I think that, yeah, it's like, get in more sort of get in touch with, reify, reinvigorate, reinstill, that sense of will and meaning, that you already have. It's already there. It's a matter of like, how do we get into a practice where we re-inspire ourselves and we remember why we were doing this in the first place, right? Exactly. Yeah. And so rather than sort of either, you could do this a number of ways. You could do mirror affirmations. You can do all kinds of things, right, to like try to build yourself up. But this kind of practice where you play with a future that might be, what it does is it calls upon, yeah, sort of the greatness of your vision, what is beautiful about it, and you can be more inspired. Indeed.
Okay, so as you mentioned, hopefully people will be able to find this report. To the extent that I can, I will put a link in the show notes. Before you tell us where everyone can find you, are there other aspects of your work that you feel are important to highlight. I mean, you and I know each other. I know that you've mentioned journalism and all that. I know you've worked a lot in branding and marketing and communications and all that. But um, what else is it that people can think about Jeremy Nulik for? And then where can everyone find you?
If you're ever in a moment of change, or if you're in a moment where it's hard to know what to do first, I suppose that that's the kind of thing that I enjoy. I enjoy, I guess what makes me tick is seeing people develop in their sense um, that they could face whatever future, that they and can invest in what they need to get past it, and they have everything they need to do that. And so helping people at the level of their organization, helping people one to one, whatever it is. Even part of what motivated me in journalism was the same stuff. It was like, how do I tell stories that can do that? So if there's something about like, what is Jeremy? Well, I don't know. I'm a friend for the end of the world, man. If it seems like there's not a good way out or whatever, or if it's hard to know what to do next, I'm I love those kinds of situations. I'm yeah, I I really love hopelessness. Apparently, that's the point. Yeah. But like yeah. So and how to find me? So there's a Big Wide Sky. If you go to Big Wide Sky, BAGWIDESKY.com, you can find me there. There's Googling Jeremy and then Nulik, NULIK, that you can find me. I'm on LinkedIn a fair bit. I don't stay on social media very much. But yeah, I mean, I'm always deeply curious to have more and better conversations about what people see in their futures. So please reach out.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jeremy. I will put in the show notes how people can find you and also hopefully a link to that report. And then I'm sure that we will be talking again. So thank you again, Jeremy.